Hi there, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I am thrilled to introduce our third power panel of the year. Tonight, we present a demon in the house, subverting the gender binary in women's writing. The panel features 6 incredibly accomplished Canadian women authors to explore the subject. Our moderator this evening is Susan Swan, a novelist and activist with international publications. Swan's acclaimed feminist fiction has been published in 18 countries and translated into 9 different languages. Our panel tonight features multiple award-winning female authors. Mona Awad, whose writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Time, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. She teaches in the creative writing program at Syracuse University. Heather O'Neill, a Montreal-based author whose books include Lullabies for Little Criminals and The Lonely Hearts Hotel. O'Neill has won the Canada Reads Competition, the Paragraph Hugh McLennan Prize for Fiction, and the Danuta Lead Award. We also have Jael Richardson, author of The Stone Thrower and Gutter Child. Jael is a book columnist on CBC's Q and the founder and executive director for the Festival of Literary Diversity. Jael holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. And then all the way from Fogo Island, we have Tanya Talaga, an Anishinaabe journalist and speaker. Tanya is a journalist and writer. Her first book, 7 Fallen Feathers, is a national bestseller and won the RBC Taylor Prize, the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing, and the First Nation Communities Read Award. And finally, but not least, Kim Thúy. Kim has received so many awards, including the Governor General's Literary Award. Her books have sold more than 850,000 copies around the world, and they've also been translated into 29 different languages. I can tell you right now, it is a formidable group. To all the viewers, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Susan will take as many questions as possible, starting at around 7:45. So Susan, please dive right in.
Thank you, Daphna. It's very exciting for me to be here with these 5 talented younger women writers. You know, as an old feminist, it's a thrill to see all this talent. And because there's always the feeling that, you know, somehow things are going to change and it might go back to the old days when it was very unusual to have women feted and writing as many books as they are. And we're talking tonight about writing and gender binary. So I thought I'd offer my definition of gender binary, which I've compiled from articles in the New York Times, Psychology Today, Gender Spectrum, and many, many other LGBTQ publications. And this is the definition that I've come up with. Please disagree when you speak if you feel so inclined. Gender binary is the idea that there are only 2 genders, man and woman. These genders are considered opposite of each other and have defined traits in opposition and complementary of one another. The gender binary, also called gender binarism or genderism, is a belief that gender is composed of 2 distinct and opposite genders, women and men, in which there is no overlap. And as your moderator, I thought I should explain a little bit about myself. Going through life as a 6'2" woman means I'm often mistaken for a man by store clerks. And growing up in the 50s, as you might imagine, I was made to feel I was too big to be feminine. And not authentically feminine, probably in some respects what many trans women might feel. so this led me to, as a writer, to write books about women who weren't traditionally feminine, and in fact, probably led to a philosophy of, well, if I don't fit the norm, then I can make up my own rules. So that's a little bit of explanation about me as a writer and a person, and how gender binary affected me. And I wanted to start with Tanya, and talk about a March 8th essay in Lit Hub, which said that men are reluctant to read women authors, and so less likely to review or recommend their books. All of us, to a greater or lesser extent, and often without realizing it, tend to expect less of women, listen to them less attentively, and feel uncomfortable with them in positions of authority. That's what Mary Ann Siegert, the essay writer, said. And I wanted to ask you, Tanya, what does gender binary mean to you? And how is gender expressed in the Indigenous communities that you grew up in and know?
Miigwech for that question, and I'm honored to be here with everyone. I am coming to you from the traditional territory of the Beothuk people, and it is really quite spectacular to be here with you. So I just want to say, Buju, Tanya Talaga Nagisnakas, Kamusko, Pimojija Pinishish Nagisnakas. And when I think of gender binary, I think that where I come from, my mother's family, being an Anishinaabeg person, we have at least 12 different words to talk about what it means to be in a state of being, to be gendered.
12 different words. Wow.
At least, yeah. I mean, we always lifted up two-spirited people. We always took people for who they are. I have a different view of gender, I think, than people that do not come from an Indigenous community. So, how does it affect your writing? You write with spirit. You write from who you are. That's who I have always written with. I write for everyone, but I write, I hope, with the voice of my ancestors, and they come in many different forms. And it's interesting what you were saying, though, the quote that you had there about people not reading female writers. Very true. And I would take it a step further and saying, if you're an Indigenous female writer, or if you're an Indigenous writer, you are less likely to be read. You know, I think of my friend when we're having this discussion tonight, Lee Miracle, who had a hard time being published 30 years ago, 35 years ago. It was almost impossible. No one wanted to listen to Indigenous women. Nobody wanted to hear our voices. We've had to fight, claw, and get up into the CanLit world to have Canada hear our stories. So it's a pretty big question that I could take up probably the whole hour answering.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I remember that time when Lee was younger and still alive, and it was a struggle. But it also still is a struggle somehow for women fiction writers to be seen as authoritative as male fiction writers. This Irish novelist, John Boyle, has this story about being at a festival, and these three very talented male authors were on a panel, and they were introduced as giants of literature. And then the next panel was three women, and they were of equal stature, but they were described as wonderful storytellers. So there is this whole dynamic where somehow a woman fiction writer it's accepted that there are many of us now and many good ones, but somehow there's some authority that hasn't been the same authority that's given to men, that there, has not been given to women. I mean, Anne Enright has this story she tells that if a man wrote "a cat sat on a mat," he would be complimented for his economy of prose. And if a woman wrote "a cat sat on a mat," she would be considered banal. So what you're saying is that there were really an extra burden being an Indigenous and a female writer when you were starting out.
It was a gift, for sure. It is a gift. Burden all comes from the eye of the beholder. It was harder to get our stories published, for sure. When I started off as a newspaper writer as well, I mean, there was not a very big appetite in the 90s, the 2000s, for Indigenous stories at all. That is changing. It hasn't changed enough. But yeah,
Well, you're helping to change it, I think, definitely.
Yeah.
Your book, Seven Feathers, describes what happens to 7 Indigenous children who are sent from the reserves to high school in Thunder Bay. What did they learn about gender in a mainly white urban environment, and how did that affect their ability to cope with life there? Was that part of the shock of the transition, or was that not a factor?
Absolutely. For some of the students in particular, yes, it was. And you have the increased issue of coming to Thunder Bay away from your family when you are 13, 14, 15, and you don't know anybody. You get on a little plane and you are not speaking in English as your first language. Many of our kids that come from the north, they speak Cree, Uchi-Cree, Uchi-Pwe, they're speaking Anishinaabe, and they come to a city that doesn't want them. They come to a city where they have to learn how to cross a street, where they have to, a street with traffic lights, because First Nations communities in Northern Ontario don't have traffic lights. There are no malls, there are no restaurants. It's a complete and utter culture shock to be in a place like Thunder Bay. I would imagine it would almost seem like Las Vegas, because you're so used to living in an absolutely different environment. And then you come to this city that you learn everything, and having, if you're having, working through who you are as a person too, on top of that, that's so hard and difficult, even more so for a child that already feels alone.
Yeah. I've given that book out to many people that want to understand about the transition between leaving a reserve and, coming into city life, and they're always come away amazed. All right, thank you for that. I'm going to talk to Mona for a minute, who's been described as one of our most original and inventive chroniclers of the female experience. And I wonder how you define gender binary and how that has affected you as a person, and how it has affected your writing.
Well, first of all, I'm really honored to be here with all of you. So thank you so much for having me. And Susan, I'm actually a huge fan of. I remember reading The Wives of Bath when I was a teenager, and it was a really important book for me. So it's nice to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. I actually I agree with your definition. That's kind of how I experienced it as a young person growing up in first Montreal and then Mississauga in the 90s. And I think I found it extremely oppressive. I also didn't feel like I fit in with that idea of what a young girl should look like, should behave like, should be. And I think my writing was always a kind of form of rebellion against that, which is probably why in 13 Ways and in Bunny too, I sort of imagine femininity as a kind of prison, even as I'm fascinated by it, of course, and I acknowledge that it has power, and I'm smitten by that power, but I'm also very suspicious of it, and really interested in critiquing it, and how we internalize it and how it damages us. I think my work is really dedicated to that and always has been. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm amazed at what you can write, because I've read your books, and I've read all the books of the panelists, and the bravery that it's extraordinary, what you're able to write and say now. When I was starting to write, we were accused of not offering positive images of women in our fiction, and so I salute you. I think that it takes courage, because there is always, particularly if you're dealing with an erotic aspect in your fiction, to be tainted by someone who writes, a woman who writes about sex. And I noticed that one of your critics said that your second novel, Bunny, was bewilderingly erotic. And I found that a fascinating comment, and I wondered what you thought of the remarks like that.
I find that fascinating. Bewilderingly erotic, bewilderingly. I mean, that book is interested in desire, and it's interested in a lot of different kinds of desire, and the way that they kind of overlap. You know, my main character has a lot of desire that's bound up in the fact that she's an artist, she's a creative person, and she's interested in exploring that. But she's also using her imagination as a place where she finds companionship, and then that companion becomes embodied, you know, she externalizes it. So there's a longing too there for intimacy, for friendship, for connection. So yeah.
And yet there's this claustrophobic nature of the friendships with the bunnies, and there was something sort of weirdly erotic about that claustrophobia. It was as if they were always just one step away from seducing each other.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, she's fascinated by them. She's drawn to them. She's attracted to them, you could even say, but she's also repulsed by them and afraid of them.
With good reason.
Yeah, absolutely, with good reason. They're monstrous, but they're also they're powerful, you know.
They are. Another critic said you weaponized cuteness.
Yeah.
And I wondered what you thought of that comment.
Well, I did, yeah, very intentionally, because I'm terrified of cuteness, and I'm terrified of the power that it has over me, and how seductive it can be, and yet how innocent it appears, you know.
Yes.
So I thought, what a great kind of monster, a cute monster.
A cute monster.
Yeah. So I was really interested in exploring that, just how much cuteness can leave us completely defenseless. Sam's case,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, she gets totally lost in the cult of it.
She does. Well, this leads me to Heather, who has said about her new novel, When We Lost Our Heads, I'm pushing back against the idea of femininity that doesn't include violence or chaos. Can you tell us a little bit of the story of your novel and what you're trying to do about gender binary in there? Because you seem to be taking it on full bore, I would say.
Oh yeah, sure. I was really interested. I mean, the scaffolding of the story, it's set in Victorian Montreal, where the idea of the gender binary was so incredibly policed, and down to, you know, any action you had. And so that was an interesting time period for me to work within, because I always find whatever the gender binary is, it's these characteristics that were defined when women were under conditions of oppression and subjugation. And then we found these ideas of, well, women behave in such and such way, in such and such way. And it's like, basically you're describing someone without any freedom or agency. This is not an inherently feminine quality or something that
Mhm.
belongs to women, and we don't even know what it is to be a woman because we've been so pushed into these molds.
Mhm.
So I was interested in that, and then I used the French Revolution because I was so fascinated by these characters of the French Revolution when I was a child. But I was always disappointed that everything they wrote and talked about was so not. It was about freedom, but not at all intersectional, and was only about a certain group of European men, and women were left entirely out of the equation. And I had seen this Victorian girl who was dressed up as Robespierre. And then I was like, I want her to be Robespierre. And then this idea came where I could have women, what it would be like if they were inhabiting these revolutionary roles and showing the power of women's ambition, women's jealousy, women's rage, women's duplicity, all these natural human emotions, but what it would be like if these women, when I took, and I just centered the women and took out romance and their relationships with men and how they would enact and how women, who we become under our own gazes. Because the other thing about the gender binary, when I was growing up, it's so about how men perceive women.
Mhm.
And, I had a trans parent, and she had moved to Provincetown and transitioned into a man and changed their name to Abraham. So, and they had this girlfriend whose name was Diane, and Diane was this butch lesbian who wore these really remarkable motorcycle outfits and had her hair short and spiked up. And my parent would always say how beautiful Diane was, and this group of women, and it was just so different. And what they would point out that was appealing about other women was so different than what men would see. It was always whether a woman was really funny or really dynamic, or their eyes, and it was just so not anything that men would consider feminine whatsoever. And then I just realized I was so growing up, every time it was an insult when someone tells you that you're not acting as a woman should, and then then they just oppress. It's just a way of cutting you down and making you smaller. And so that I was kind of going off of this whole gender binary, which just basically confines women to certain traits, and it's so absurd. And and when we respond, if we can see ourselves when women are more in power and more in communication and colleagues with one another, we start to form our personalities from the female gaze as opposed to the male gaze, and we become so much more interesting and fascinating as people, because you don't make friends just because they're pretty and do whatever you say. You become friends. And that's why there was this friendship at the heart of the novel with two young women who are both narcissistic and psychopathic and very problematic, but at the same time, they just they're so interested in what the other one is doing and competing with them and spending their lives together, sort of trying to fulfill these remarkably absurd ambitions. So it was just, I wanted to just, when I look at women, I look at my own experience of who I am and who women that I've met, and as opposed to looking at what traditionally men have written and then just responding to that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, because you've made me really think about this. When you write really honestly and intuitively about what it means, what your women characters feel, then in a sense you are subverting the gender binary, because we don't really know what women have been until recently. And I'll tell you a story with a young group of girls. I was talking to them about 20 years ago, and I said, all this sex that you see in the Hollywood movies is fake. That's not how I experience sex as a woman, and my friends neither. And they whispered among themselves, and then they said to me, "We've talked it over, and you're wrong." So that this whole concept of what women are and their sexuality has been a great disservice to both men and women, I think. And in your novel, the gender fluidity just feels like it's a natural part of their character. It doesn't feel like you're trying to make a point. It's a description that feels authentic.
Yeah, that was one of the things, like I always hated growing up when people said that boys were more sexual and had these greater sexual desires. And I was like, oh no, I'm a total pervert. The things that go in my head
Yeah.
completely wild and crazy, and like they're just as they're just as excitable. And it's also because sexuality has so much to do with the drive and energy. So to say that you don't have this ferocious sexual desire is also implying that you don't have this libido in life. You don't have this passionate urge to just go for things in life in the same way. It's just very subtle. By taking away women's sexuality, you're also just taking a lot of other things away from them, and just this general sort of agency and unpredictability.
You say somewhere in the novel about women when they inhabit their sexuality, it doesn't lead to inequity, falling into the gutter. It empowers them, and I thought that was very, very true. You also said that sex was like theater, a way of enacting social structures in the novel. Can you expand on that sentence for us?
Yeah, this is particularly through the character of Sadie, who is a pornographer, and she was so interested in seeing describing what people wanted in bed and how that was shaped by society and what was secretly going on with men and the way she interacted with them at the brothel, and what she was able to kind of poke out of men in their elaborate fantasies that they went to the brothel to hide. And she was interested in all these fantasies that men have, that women have, and how what we can find out about ourselves in our fantasies. Because even a lot of sexual fantasies, when you have negative things going in, or oppressive ideas, and it really makes you question, like, why is that in my head, and how what influences that from society, or how much is it just role playing in my brain? It's just a fast these dark, these complex fantasies that of what's going on in women's head, we don't actually share them with one another because they're so unfeminine. Anything that's unfeminine was regarded as taboo. So
that's right.
By speaking about them, it's such because when we project them in our heads, it's so, we don't censor them, we just do it to turn ourselves on. It's getting crazy. But it's a natural thing. So it's a sort of truth telling, and it's almost so Sadie wants to really explore like what it is that is in our dark sexual desires and how that comes to be.
Well, the truth telling, I think is really the most powerful way of subverting gender binary. Anyway, thank you. And I'm going to talk to Jael about gender binary and how it affects you as a Black woman, and how it affected your father, the football player Chuck Ely. And your first book was a nonfiction book about his life, The Stone Thrower, and his escape from the ghetto inspired your debut novel, Gutter Child. I found that a very touching story about going back to your dad's neighborhood and seeing that he had made it out of the ghetto, but his friends were still there. And so I wanted to ask you about just gender binary as a Black woman and a Black man, what you've observed in your life about it, how it plays out. And then I wanted to ask you about Gutter Child, but I'll ask you that.
Yeah, I think first of all, just to clarify, my dad grew up in the segregated projects in the States. So not necessarily the ghetto. I think that has certain connotations to it. And I think, segregated projects because they were forced to live there, right? They were given a specific space that they were allowed to buy property or rent in, and certain places that they weren't allowed to buy property or rent in. And then those places were called things like the ghetto in order to make it seem less desirable. And so that's sort of, I've been fascinated with systems like that, with the ways in which words play into the way we see each other, the way we engage with one another, the way we elevate one group over another. And so I think gender does come into that. With my dad, especially with the memoir, Stone Thrower. I mean, the interesting thing is growing up with a dad who was a professional athlete, and then being an athlete yourself, you see huge differences in the way sport treats women and the way women are talked about, treated, asked to dress when it comes to sport. And they're, you know, I also grew up in a very Christian religious home. And so the gender binary is like very, very lined up, cut in half.
Two boxes
in the church. And it's part of this same fascination for me with systems. I think systems really like clean lines, neat boxes. Women do this and they sit in this spot and perform these roles. Men do this and sit in this spot and perform these roles. And so looking at my dad's life, one of the things that really fascinated me was the role of ambition, and the way my dad's ambition and personal drive set him up for these really instrumental moments. And the way that that same ambition lived in me, but was like, felt like it was constantly being bumped against by expectations about what a woman should do, what a woman should aim for, aspire for. And a lot of ways that's shaped. I just did an essay for a collection called Good Mom on Paper. And I think one of the things that's shaping a lot of my questions about gender roles in particular is, you know, as a mom, what does it look like to be a businesswoman and to have ambition and to set yourself up in a way that is often, you know, descriptions, terms, words that are reserved for men? And where is the, you know, why is it to men's benefit to create these lines? I mean, I think we can all see it is in the benefit of men to keep the line very black and white, this or that. And that when women, when non-binary folks push against those lines, when we blur those lines, we create questions that create problems for men. And that's important work to be doing. It's exhausting work to be doing. But I think when we acknowledge that the system benefits from us staying inside the lines, staying with a very neat divide, that we all are in greater danger of, you know, revisiting the problems of the past, limiting the opportunities of, you know, kids, the next generation, however you want to word it. So yeah, looking at my dad's life really showed me what ambition can do, and that I needed to kind of let that ambition free in my own life, really push against boundaries that say I should stay at home,
right,
not build a career for myself, not do all the things that were growing inside me that I instinctively wanted to do. And that sort of culture was saying, that's not, you know, that's not your role, that's not your time, wait till your kids are out of the house, kind of thing.
Yeah. You can write when they're napping.
Yes, exactly.
That sort of thing. Yeah. In Gutter Child, you wrote about a world divided into two: the poor, who began life with a financial debt. I thought that was a brilliant stroke. They have a debt to pay right at the beginning. And then there are the mainlanders who are privileged. And then there are the 100 children from the poor section, some mainlander families adopt to see if they can be raised as mainlanders. How did gender affect your male and female characters in Gutter Child? Could you want to talk about your characters, the male and female?
I had sort of 5 main characters, 3 women, Elamina, Josephine, and Violet, and then 2 men, Rowan and David. And I was really interested in how the system impacted the 5 of them differently, both the stories that they arrive in, but also how the women are sort of in this indebted system are further indebted, because I wanted to look at the way, again, gender is used to create power dynamic. And so I was interested in exploring that. There are also two characters that I was sort of playing with as non-binary, because I wanted to think about what happens to the people who sit in between the lines. That's always my fascination as well. Where would they go? How would they be treated? What would the problem be, right? And the issue is, if you can't stay inside the lines, then you're a greater problem than anybody else, More difficult than being a woman is being someone who is non-binary, who says, I'm neither of these things, and I'm questioning it and I'm pushing it, because that questions the system, and the system exists to eliminate questions, to make it so that people follow in rows, in neat lines, obey the rules.
And they're predictable too.
Predictable. You have to have predictable, enforceable, clear, unquestionable rules in systems that are designed for oppression, which colonization is. And so, yeah, that's what I was interested in, what happens to these female characters and the male characters, how they're treated differently, how they each respond to a system differently. One of the characters, the female characters, does have ambition, and she does have dreams and aspirations, and that actually becomes the most dangerous thing. It actually leads her to the greatest disappointment, because she believes that things can change and will get better just by dreaming and hoping. And that's one of the things I think a system is also set up. It's set up to sort of not allow things to change very easily. It's built tough, and it's built to reinforce itself when people create problems. And I think, just to wrap up, I think as Black women, we have a lot of pushing against systems to do, to be heard, to be recognized, to be acknowledged. And I think Black folks, non-binary folks in particular, are often excluded, ignored. And, in some ways I feel that there are other people who should be here talking about this. But I'm very grateful, and it's just made me think a lot about the ways in which I do my work at Fold, and the ways in which I really want to make room for these kinds of conversations, because I think the conversations create action, and action creates change, and the system doesn't want those things. So we have to actively make efforts to do that.
And novels can help create change too. But I was struck by how emotionally real their relationships felt. There's a real emotional power in their relationships. It didn't feel like you were trying to make a point. It felt like the characters were real people, and that's always powerful. Anyway, thank you. And I'm going to ask Kim about gender binary and how it's affected her as a woman and a writer. And also, if you could tell us a little bit about the literary culture in Vietnam or Vietnamese immigrant communities, how the gender binary plays out in those situations.
Vietnamese, the Vietnamese language doesn't have any gender. We don't have feminine, masculine, right? And then when I arrived here in Quebec, well, the language is French. And one of the first things that you have to master is the gender of the words. Each word has a gender, right? Not like English, right?
That's right.
You don't always have gender, but in French, you cannot speak without knowing the gender of the word. But then I came from, I arrived here when I was 10. So in my mind, words don't have gender. Didn't have any gender. And it was very strange, basically, to give a gender to a word.
It felt very arbitrary and peculiar.
Yeah. Why a table is feminine? Why honor is masculine? And then right away you see the unbalance almost. I just felt like there was something subjective about giving crisis to a woman. Why crisis is feminine, whereas merit is masculine. So that force, because of the Vietnamese language, without gender, it it forced me to ask questions about each word, about
Each
the
word.
gender,
Wow.
because you have to learn, and I still make so many mistakes because I'm always confused about catastrophe. To me, was men. I don't know why. And then catastrophe to man.
I know why.
And then so I made that mistake I still remember this text where I just wrote, catastrophe as masculine. And then I could remember, I learned it very later on that catastrophe is feminine. Finally, it went into my head, it stuck with me because of the word libido, because libido is also feminine, catastrophe. And so the analysis of gender for me, it's about words and the meaning, why the moon is feminine and the soleil, the sun, is masculine. Is it because of the softer light? Is it, but the soleil is sometimes feminine in other languages. Right. And
yeah, it is a fascinating exercise to look at all the different French words and genders that they have. It's
the difference is that in Vietnamese, the most important thing to know is the hierarchy of the relationship you have with the person in front of you. You need to know right away if the person in front of you is a little bit older, a lot older than your parents or not. And you have to call them, to address to them with the respect that they should receive because of the hierarchy. Whereas in French, you don't have that. The most you have is tu and vous, which is more the connectedness or the closeness of two people. And it's not about the hierarchy, because
it's not a social hierarchy.
Yeah. So I had to learn, more about that. And so the power, maybe because I come from a country at war, where women, were the one who stayed back and held that country together, right? You could see all these, so many men were on a battlefield that the women had to take over. And to me, I don't see in the act of cooking for a child, for example, is a woman thing. Is actually something very powerful, because you can create memory for a child, right? For cooking for that child. And so it's and to have this power to feed somebody.
Yeah, no, that is a power. I'm getting a note here that I have to remind the audience, if you want to do the questions for the Q&A, start sending them in now. We will spend the last 15 minutes answering questions from the audience. But going back to what you're saying, Kim, I was struck by the power of the female characters in your novels. And there are a couple of images that have stayed with me. One is it's a rather horrendous image, but it is somehow an image of perseverance and strength. It's about an older Vietnamese woman who's wearing a conical hat, and she drowns in a sea of excrement behind the outhouse. And there is the other image of these skinny young Vietnamese girls in a restaurant with men throwing $100 bills at them. And you talk about them having a stoic silence. What accounts for this enormous strength that these female characters have? Does that come from the culture in some way?
Of all the extreme challenges, we had to, because Vietnam was a province of China, in order for Vietnam to detach itself from China, it was a fight. And those fights, the two, how do you say that, heroine, the female heroes, how do you say, heroines are women, riding elephants. And they fought, the story is that they fought against China, to become independent. And another story fighting against China was that the Chinese emperor or something wanted a Vietnamese woman. And then the woman, the Vietnamese had to say yes to this wedding. But then they gave the woman away, but then somehow they came with a whole army to attack the Chinese or something like that. So it's always
Wow.
through the that we won against the Chinese power, and then after that, we had the French and then the Americans. So I think Vietnam has gone through so many extreme challenges that you don't have a choice to be resilient.
And there's this warrior aspect to the women. They were warriors too with the men. All right, I think I have to now ask questions from the audience, and I still have questions too. So let me just bear with me here. 2 questions. Okay, here is one from Sally Adams Jones. I have written a novel where the protagonist is gender fluid, as well as her orientation. I understand you can't find a publisher without an agent these days. Can you advise how to find an agent who might be interested? Most are not interested in gender fluid protagonists, this person says. Does anyone want to tackle that? Maybe Heather?
No, ask Jael.
Jael, you go.
I will just tackle it from a professional side in 2 reasons. First of all, I think when you're writing things that you haven't maybe seen in publishing before, is to find books that are also doing the same thing, and to look at the way that, not the way where that author is now, but where that author started, and look at the kinds of places that publish first works on those kinds of subject matter. So places like Arsenal Pulp Press, for example, are very well known for stories that are very that don't have to fit inside a box. The other thing I'll say, because I love a plug, is Fold is coming up in about a month, May 1st to the 8th. And on May 1st, we always have a session on Publishing 101 that will kind of walk you through how to get published, what it's like to work with an editor, how to do publicity. And for me, going to those kinds of workshops at festivals was really, really helpful, especially like a lot of people think you have to have an MFA. You don't. You can sort of build your own MFA by going to workshops and events that are offered by libraries and festivals, et cetera, et cetera. So no matter what you're writing,
that's a good point.
Yeah, no matter what kinds of line blurring you're doing, do it. I encourage that. I think we all would. And I would say just, look for similar books and where those authors began. And then, take advantage of opportunities that are offered in workshops, libraries, festivals.
Okay, thank you. I've got another quite a long question, and maybe this is my trans daughter and I were recently talking about how nice it is to see a far more broad awareness around trans issues. My daughter identified herself as trans only about 12 years ago at 15, and at the time, neither she nor I could find much information or supports anywhere. It feels like in such a short time since, however, we both feel like it is much more out there. We both want to thank you all on this panel for being part of the discussion and exploration of a gender and all its textures. As you know, it is essential to be represented and accepted. Well, this isn't a question, but a kind of affirmation to all of you. Here's another question, but lots of questions. When you develop a female character, do you become like an actor playing a part in your head so that you know what that character would think, do, or say? Who wants to take that on? Heather or Mona?
I would say no. Each of my characters is somehow some aspect of myself that then I just develop into a whole world. And I think when they really become real to me, they start acting with their own agency almost. Like when I created my latest book, I was so surprised that Sadie and Marie became best friends and became the central characters. And I expected them to be antagonists, but every time they got together, they were so in love with each other. And I was like, oh my, these characters have fallen in love. There's nothing I can do but just go with it. So I think it's, I just see them as, I just treat them as though they're real. And sometimes I dream about them and they show up in my dreams. And I'm always like, oh, what are you doing here outside of the book? And they're like, ah.
Know that they do become real, I think. I once thought the characters in The Wives of Bath woke up in the middle of the night and I was sure they were running up the stairs. It's sort of spooky. Anyway, I'd better move on to the next question here. Sports Illustrated publishes the most popular women's calendar each year. On the other hand, calendars that feature men's bodies have a small market. May one of you comment on this example of gender binary? Mona, I'll ask you to respond to that.
I have to respond. Okay, I don't know what to say. I mean, I want to see featuring men's bodies. I mean, I want to see men's bodies on Sports Illustrated, you know? I mean, I guess I want to see more diversity, I guess.
I mean, I can just say with Sports Illustrated, it's a men's magazine, right? So
Right.
it's like a cis men's magazine
Yeah,
too, right?
exactly.
So
It's
they're
like,
going to be way more interested in women's bodies. And when the men's stuff comes out, the market just isn't as developed.
Right.
It's just based, I think that's.
yeah, I mean, I think
That's a very adroit way of putting it. The market isn't as developed.
like
Yeah,
the
go
nature-
ahead, Mona.
yeah, I was just gonna say it's the nature of that magazine, right? Like you gosh, we've been looking at those images of like women like for ages, but it
Mhm.
would be nice to see something else in that magazine. I wouldn't mind seeing something that surprised me for once, you know, as opposed to just the same old, same old.
Yay for surprises. Okay, here's another question. Catastrophe is male. Historically and mythically, for starters, where are sources for strength, integrity, and self-esteem? Can they not be genderless? Kim, do you want to take on that?
I think I didn't understand the question that catastrophe is male. Well, in French is feminine. C'est une catastrophe, right? And
Yes.
and it's true in my mind. It's a male thing, or I don't know why. I because again still today, you know, there's no gender for me to if events don't have gender and objects don't have gender. So it's very foreign to me, you know. I know I've been in Quebec now for 42 years, and I've been speaking French, and I think in French for the last 43 years, but still, this concept is foreign to me. So I don't quite understand the question.
I'm not sure either she or he wants where are our sources for strength, integrity, and self-esteem? Can they not be genderless? I would.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we, you know, humans, first of all, and we have all these traits, and we're all capable of greatness and cruelty.
That's a good point. Now, here's another question. Gosh, there are a lot of questions here. We are seeing connections among the sides, femicide, ecocide, genocide. Are any of you seeing these connections rising in literature? Tanya?
Thanks for that. I was going to say this is probably the only one I can actually answer because I write nonfiction, and
you don't subscribe to Sports Illustrated, Tanya.
I sorry,
I'm
don't.
disappointed to hear that.
Don't read it. Yeah. But that's all I write about. I write about the deaths of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I write about the genocide that is happening in this country, that has happened in this country. I write about the death of the planet, what climate change is doing to our communities, what climate change has done to the earth, to the air, to the water, the sky. I mean, these are all the realities of being an Indigenous writer. And so we can't help but connecting them all together because we are all connected. So that's how we write. And
your latest book, All Our Relations, you're talking about youth suicide, aren't you, in that book?
That book started as a book on youth suicide, but it began to be, and it became a book on genocide. It became a book on what has happened here on Turtle Island in Canada and America. in all colonized Indigenous nations. Actually, I picked 5 and I wrote about them. It's it has all of the points that I just mentioned. We
You picked
cannot.
5. You picked 5. What? I just missed that.
Oh, 5 countries. I mean, like America, Canada. I wrote about Australia. I wrote about Brazil and also the Sami lands. I was in northern Norway. So all of these things are connected to us, and we cannot help but write about these things and explore them.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at my time. We've got 5 minutes left and still tons of questions. Several Canadian transgender authors have gained some measure of success and wider readership. Have any of the panel members explored this growing body of literature? Would anyone like to take that on?
I mean, what does that mean? Have we read them, engaged with them? Of course.
Yeah.
Like, if you're part of the
Yeah.
Canadian writing community, you've
Yeah.
what writers like Casey Platt and Vivek Shera are doing is just remarkable and interesting. So as a woman, of course, you would, with any sort of intellectual curiosity, I mean, I probably speak for us all. We've all been following that in a very interesting way. And Johnny Appleseed was a huge book last year by a two-spirited writer, which was also widely read and shared and talked about in the writing community.
What I will say about that is I think that, first of all, Canada, CanLit, has been very interested in certain kinds of stories, and it's a system. There's certain kinds of boxes and certain kinds of stories that have been given space and room and popularity, and others that have not. And I think, some of the writers Heather mentioned, Casey, Vivek, Kai Cheng Tom, Ivan Coyote, these are all writers that have been pushing against the very limited, restricted way that CanLit has operated. And they've done it at great cost, going to events and being abused, mistreated. So I think it's really important for us to pay attention, because this is not new. It's been happening. People just like Black writers, Indigenous writers, trans writers have been writing from time, but there has been more space has been made recently to give a larger platform, and that's important. It's important that we pick up those stories. It's important that we read the stories. It's important that wherever we come from our backgrounds, that we're challenging these concepts, and we're uplifting, upholding, and protecting these writers, because they're doing important, incredible work, and they're doing it oftentimes at a cost, and personal and otherwise.
I think that's true, and thank you for saying that. Another question, Kim and M, you write about the destiny of a boy and little girl who ultimately end up improbably crossing paths much later. Both seem equal in their strength and heroism and humanity. You don't seem to favor a perspective over the other on gender. Is this right?
Oh, well, because in M, those 2 characters were orphans, and I don't know, when you're an orphan on the street, you're no longer human, almost. You have to survive as you can, and that's why I wanted both of them to rise as a boy, and not because they were a boy and a girl, but as 2 orphans who succeeded at getting out of that destiny, basically, because of life. Sometimes life does give you a second chance at it, and so no, it was not about a boy or girl, but because it was based on a picture, a real picture of a boy and a girl, and that's why there were, if the picture was about two little girls, probably I would have set them up as 2 sisters, but then because the original picture was with a boy and a girl. And yes, I do find, all those kids, they are stronger than strong, right?
Okay, thank you. And I just want to get in a question to you all. Why do you think men are reluctant to read fiction by women? Because there have been studies that show that this is the case. women will read fiction by men and women, and men don't read as much fiction by women as they read fiction by men. Why are we more wide-ranging in our fiction choices?
I would be interested in the survey. I would assume that it's cis men and probably cis straight men that are being surveyed in that question.
Mhm.
And I think that when you're when you're considered the voice of authority, reading fiction by others who are not perceived as authority or carrying wisdom seems like frivolous activity. I think that's how
interesting.
some with a power, like what I've
Frivolous,
seen
yeah.
from men who are in positions of power, especially white cis men who have not questioned or thought about these things, they don't actually think they're important. They don't actually see the impact of them in their everyday lives. And so reading fiction by women who are imagining things or making things up, there's not that validity to them built in. And there's not that recognition that their lives are deeply missing a perspective, multiples of perspectives that they would benefit from.
I have a theory that it might also be about the way men define themselves to themselves, which is often by not being female. Like when I was growing up, the worst thing you could say to a teenage boy was to call him Woman Smith, if his last name was Smith, Woman Smith, as if being female was somehow, something to be avoided and took away from manliness. So I wonder if there is that sort of association with women's fiction where it isn't kind of manly to be reading women. I don't know. I'm talking. I want you to talk. We have to go soon. We're starting to get over time, but I just want to hear what one or two of you says about it.
I think we're more curious. We want to know what other people think, maybe more than men do.
More curious. That's interesting.
Yeah, about the other person, well, I'm generalizing here, but I think, maybe the fact that we can be mothers, or I don't know, that we have to care for someone else than us, something like that. And that gives us this power to be curious about other people, maybe a bit more, but I don't know. I'm just, saying this.
No, it's a sort of wild question. Tanya, do you have a thought about that?
I think cisgendered men want to read about themselves, and they want to read about their adventures and discovering ships and stuff like that, and being explorers. Sorry, like that's like try and find a book by an Indigenous woman. Like I keep talking about Lee Maracle, but you couldn't get our books in libraries. They weren't stocking Indigenous women's books. And when you look at Canadian society, where are Indigenous women on that very much a triangle with the cisgendered men up here, reading their books about explorers and ships and all those things that the men, they do read a certain type of book sometimes, don't they? And when you look at our books and our voices, sometimes you have to really hunt for them too. You have to go back to community and living sections to find like nonfiction books by Indigenous or Black women. They're not sometimes at the front of stores. I think that also plays into it as well. It's market. It's our books getting out there? Do we have the same reach?
All right.
Are we given the same reach? Because I would argue we do have the same reach. Are we given the same reach?
Right.
Yeah, for me, it's always absurd because women always read more fiction. Just like if you have book groups, creative writing classes, there's always filled with women. This is the market. Like when people say men aren't reading books, it's like, who cares? I mean, like the massive market is women. And it's so, and why does it delegitimize it that it's an activity that men do less of? Like men don't worry. They're like, oh my God, there's no women here. How do we get the women in? They don't even care. So I think it's this idea also that to legitimize something, men have to be interested in it. And for me, I'm always like, do you care about the male market? It's like, yeah, I love when men read my book just because it's another sale. But like, if they weren't, who cares? Like, why does that delegitimize it in any sort of way? And I like that women in editor roles, we've just kind of taken over. Like you go into publishing, all the editors are women, the presidents are women. It's just this women love fiction.
Well, it's interesting. There was a study of major US and UK literary prizes from 2000 to 2015, and it found that the more prestigious the award, the more likely the novel that won would have main male characters. So that's sort of an interesting footnote to this. We're running over time. I've got one more question here. Daphne, you'll have to tell us what to do.
Why don't you ask the one more question and then we'll wrap it up, Susan.
Okay, this is from Kim Eklund. I'm also curious about your ideas about the tradition of gender fluidity as a characteristic of creativity. Oh, good question. I'm thinking of Virginia Woolf's Orlando and others. Do you identify your creativity as genderless? Mona, where are you? I've got the questions up, so I can't see some of your faces.
Yeah, I mean, Orlando was a really important book for me. I remember getting really excited about writing after I read Orlando, particularly because of that character's fluidity. And I remember reading Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson, and that was one of the first books I'd ever read where the character doesn't identify. There's no gender attached to the protagonist. And I remember thinking that was so exciting, and in Bunny, Sam, that's sort of how I envisioned her in my head. I mean, she presented as a woman, but in my head, her voice and just the way that she pursued her creativity, it was genderless. She actually shifts genders, with her characters. And that was tied, I think, to my idea of creativity as being sort of like in conversation with gender, but also detached from gender.
Okay, thank you. Daphne, there's a question for you about whether the panels are going to continue. Somebody's very enthusiastic about them. So you might tell.
Thank you. I will answer that, but first I want to thank you all for this incredible conversation. I don't know what gender incroyable is, but I will say incroyable anyway. The depth of the insights that you guys provided was just priceless. Thank you for lending us your time and your talent and your generosity and your thoughts. We do have a whole network of panels coming up. Please visit our website to check out the dates and the topics of those. They continue until June. A recording of tonight's event will also be available on our YouTube channel as well as our own website. And thank you very much again, and I wish you all a good night.
Thanks to everybody. That was wonderful.
You.
Good night.
Thank you, Susan.